Hola students, today we're going to talk about percents. The concept of a percent is how much out of 100. That's what we're always thinking. Now, this example, 4 out of 5 is 80. The 4 is the part, the 5 is the whole, the total. And what you can probably see is if you multiplied 5 times 20, you get 100. And if you did the same thing with the 4, you get 80. This is creating a proportion. Why? Because we want to know how much out of 100. And whatever that number is in the fraction here, that is our percent. So that's the idea, okay? And we're going to be thinking between the ideas of ratios, decimals, and percents. So if we had the idea of a fraction of 3 over 10, well, that's 30 over 100. 1/2, 50 over 100. 3/4, 75 over 100. And remember, this number right here will be exactly what our percentage will be, okay? So let's first take a look. If we had 85%, how do we figure out that as a decimal? It's a real simple concept. Anytime you have a whole number, please remember, the decimal comes to the right of the whole number, and to find the decimal, we are simply going to move it 2 places to the left. That's it. That's all there is to it. So 85% is 0.85. I always put a 0 before the decimal point. So there we go. It changes. Now, take a look at this. When we have 5%, this can be a little tricky because remember, our decimal point is to the right. We go 2 places. But remember, if there is a gap in between the decimal point and the number, you need to fill that in with a 0. You're going to add a 0 in this case. Here, we just move it over 2, so we get 0.24. Here, we move it over 2. There's still a number in front, so we have 1.15. Here, we move it over 2, and we have a 0.157. Okay, so I'm always going to suggest that you do put that 0 in front of the decimal point. Now, some people don't. Some people just write it as 0.157. The only reason I'm saying you should put a 0, if you put that 0, it forces you almost to make sure that you write the decimal point nice and big so that everyone can see it. Okay? Let's take a look at some examples. Here, we're going to convert to percents. So we start with the decimal and we go to percent. The nice thing is all we're doing is the exact opposite. We're just going to the right. If we take a look back, from percent to decimal, we went 2 to the left. To go from decimal to percent, we're just going 2 to the right. Okay? And when we do that, same idea. Move it over, add our percent sign. Move it over to the right, add the percent sign. To the right, percent. To the right, percent. Now, what happens when you have something like this? 0.8. Same idea. We're going to go 1, 2. Here's our new decimal point. Remember, if we have a missing gap, we have to put in that 0. So, in this case, we will go to 80%. There it is. Now, what happens when you have a fraction? All right? Is this going to be any harder? Absolutely not. You need to first change that fraction into a decimal. That's the goal. And how do you do that? Well, sometimes, believe it or not, you're going to have to do what you did in earlier years. You're just going to have to do a division problem. Okay? 3 divided by 8. You're just going to have to do that math problem. And when you do that, you do get the fraction. And once you have your fraction, you're just going to do what? Move it 2 places to the right, and that's where they get 37.5%. So, sorry, there might not be an easy way to do this. Just do the division. Okay, grit your teeth. You got it. Now, moving on to something called a repeating decimal. Right? Now, the good thing about this, any repeating decimal, okay, can be put into a fraction. So you may see it as a fraction, like 1/3, and this will equal 0.3333. And just to make sure, no one wants to write this. This is a never-ending repeating decimal. So instead of writing it out, we're just going to write it as 0.3 with a line on top. Same thing over here. You just have to be careful. What is the repeating part of this? 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7, 1, 4. There we go. So we're going to put our line here, And of course, we can write it as 1428857. But you absolutely have to have the line on top in order for someone to know it's repeating. Okay? Now, what happens if someone wants you to write this as a percent? That's where things get a little bit tricky. So, how would we write 0.3 repeating as a percent, though? It's going to be the same thing. To go from decimal to percent, just like we did up here, we move it 2 places to the right, so 1, 2. So here is our new decimal place. So I'll write it as 33. Here's our decimal place. And then we're going to write this as the repeating number. How's that sound? Now, if we had something as another example, 1/6 equals 0.6 repeating, goes on and on and on. Well, we can write this. We move it 2 places to the right, so we get 66.6, and we'll put our repeating symbol on top of that last 6. Let's take a look at a few more examples. But before we get started, I'm going to just kind of go through this. The idea of a repeating decimal, they are rational numbers. And the reason why they're rational is because we can always put them into a fraction. Might be a little bit hard to understand just based on this, but I'll show you examples. So we have 0.18. We have 2 decimal places here. And what we're going to do is for every decimal place, we're going to put a 9. So we're going to compare that number that's repeating over 2 decimal places using 9s. I know it sounds a little crazy, but I'm trying to explain this in about a minute. So you just have to kind of follow along. Here, we have 3 decimal places that are repeating. So we put that number here, and we would put it over 999. And same thing here. 4 decimal places are repeating, so we would put that into a fraction over 4 9s. And that's how we go, if we have a repeating decimal, how we change it into some type of fraction. And they've changed it into a fraction in lowest terms. So that's it, just so you can see it. You can do a couple practice problems, so at least you can understand kind of the concept behind it. All right, moving on to decimal places. And we have our numbers, 23, but we're going to focus on everything to the right of the decimal point, okay? And the first decimal place is the tenths, or 1 over 10. Hundredths, 1 over 100. Thousandths, 1 over 1,000. And 10,000ths. And now it goes on and on and on. So 100,000ths, millions, 10 millions, 100 millions, and on. But let's see, how does this help us with our going from percent to decimal to fraction? So 70%, right? We move this 2 places to the left, and that gives us our decimal. So we have 0.7. But this is the tenths position. So what we can do is we can take this number and move it to the top of a fraction, and whatever position it is, we will just follow that. We will put it into the tenths position. Here, same thing. The 23% changes to 0.23. This is in the tenths hundredths position, so we put 23 over the hundredths. And so hopefully that starts to make sense. Here, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So we take the 389 and we move it into a fraction over 1,000. So let's just take a look at a couple examples. What if I had 5.8? Now, how do I write this? Well, as a fraction. We're always going to focus on the decimal place. So we would take this whole number of 58 and we would put it over what? This is in the tenths decimal place. So 58 over 10. There we go. If I had the example of 8.32, now this can be changed. We put the 832 over what? We figure on the decimal places, tenths, hundredths. So if we did this, right, 832 divided by 100, we will get this decimal number. Okay, so just a little bit of a review in decimal places. Please don't be confused if you have something that even seems strange, like 800.001. Well, in this case, remember, you're writing this entire number, 800,001, and we're using the decimal place, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. over 1,000. So hopefully that's a nice refresher and just clears your mind on decimal places and how to write fractions. All right, good luck.